My daughter forgot to hang up the phone. Through the receiver, I heard the words clearly. He has to go to a nursing home, the cheap one on the outskirts. I did not say a single word. I simply hung up, walked into town, and sold the house she thought was already hers for $950,000 in cash. 2 weeks later, my daughter and her husband returned from their luxurious vacation, smiling from ear to ear until their keys would not turn in the lock. On the doorstep, they found a single note from me. When they read it, their arrogant smiles vanished, and they started screaming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The sharp metallic crack of a hammer striking wood echoed through the hallway. It was a violent, intrusive sound in a house that had known only quiet for the past 4 years. I stood at the threshold of the living room, watching my son-in-law Cameron balance on a step stool. He was prying the heavy oak frame of my late wife Caroline's favorite landscape painting away from the brick fireplace. He did not ask for permission. He did not even look my way. Natalie stood below him, tapping her pristine fingernails against her phone screen. She ordered him to be careful with the bricks without glancing up. She told him the appraiser said the classic rustic look was completely outdated. She insisted they needed to paint the whole fireplace white to modernize it because dark brick kills the property value. Property value, not a home, not the hearth where Caroline and I used to sit every Christmas. To my 32-year-old daughter, the house I had paid off over 3 decades of grueling corporate work in Seattle was merely a real estate asset waiting to be liquidated. I stepped into the room, but neither of them stopped. They treated me like a ghost haunting my own living room. I did not yell. Decades as a senior financial analyst taught me that screaming only surrenders your power. I simply watched them dismantle my life. I turned and walked down the hall to my private study. It was my sanctuary. I closed the heavy oak door behind me and reached for the top drawer of my desk to check my mail. That is when I saw it. The small brass key ring holding the keys to my floor safe. I always kept it perfectly aligned with the edge of the leather desk mat. Always. Now it was pushed half an inch to the right. Someone had been hunting for my financial records. I did not confront them. Accusations without proof only give your enemy time to build a defense. I waited. That evening, I sat in my leather armchair listening to the sounds of my own house being occupied by strangers. I heard the shower turn on down the hall. Cameron was washing up. Natalie was in the kitchen complaining loudly about the layout of the cabinets. This was my window of opportunity. I slipped into the guest room they had commandeered. Cameron's tailored suit jacket was draped carelessly over a chair. I moved with the silent, methodical precision I used to apply to corporate audits. I slid my hand into the inner breast pocket. My fingers brushed against a folded piece of glossy paper. I pulled it out. It was a brochure. The cheap, glossy print advertised a facility called Shady Pines Care Center. It was located in the bleakest, most neglected industrial outskirt of the city, a place where the elderly were parked and forgotten. I flipped the brochure over. In Cameron's messy handwriting, there were notes scribbled in the margin. Monthly fee, power of attorney requirements, expedited admission. Before the cold reality of that brochure could fully sink into my bones, the heavy ringing of the old landline phone shattered the quiet of the house. I stepped out of the bedroom just as Natalie answered the wall phone in the kitchen. She spoke a few hushed words, then yelled out to her husband over the noise of the shower, telling him it was the clinic. Suddenly, the front doorbell chimed. The food delivery had arrived. Flustered, Natalie tossed the landline receiver onto the granite counter without hanging it up and rushed to the front door. I moved silently down the hall and stepped into my study. I picked up the extension line, holding my breath. Through the receiver, I heard the muffled chaos of the kitchen, and then Cameron's voice. He must have stepped out of the bathroom, grabbing the phone Natalie left on the counter. He spoke to the doctor, his voice dripping with false concern. He claimed his father-in-law was deteriorating rapidly. He lied, saying I was forgetting to turn off the stove and losing my keys. He told the doctor they just needed him to sign the psychiatric evaluation, certifying me as mentally incompetent. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. Natalie's footsteps returned to the kitchen. She took the phone from her husband. She hissed into the receiver, telling the doctor they were willing to pay him $5,000 in cash for that signature. She said they needed me in Shady Pines by the end of the month. She revealed that Cameron owed $200,000 to a casino syndicate, and they were threatening them. She coldly stated they had to take control of this house, mortgage it, and pay them off. She called me a confused old man who would not even know what happened. The words hit me, but they did not break me. There was no despair. There were no tears of a broken father. The 66-year-old man who had loved his daughter unconditionally died in that exact second. In his place, a ruthless, calculating analyst awoke. They wanted to steal my $950,000 house to pay off a gambling debt. They were willing to lock me in a chemical prison for the rest of my life to do it. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. In the kitchen, the conversation ended. I heard the sharp click of the receiver being placed back on the wall. Then the rhythmic tapping of Natalie's heels moving down the hallway. She was heading straight for my study. I placed the extension softly back onto its cradle. The doorknob began to turn. I sat back in my leather chair, picked up a pen, and looked toward the opening door with a perfectly calm, chilling smile. Natalie opened the door and peeked inside. She wore a sweet, fabricated smile that now made my stomach churn. She announced that dinner was ready and asked if I was feeling all right. I nodded slowly, deliberately, letting my hand tremble just a fraction as I set the pen down. I told her I was just feeling a bit tired, playing perfectly into the narrative they were constructing. We sat around the dining table, the same table where Caroline and I had celebrated Natalie's academic achievements, where we had hosted family holidays. The air felt thick, suffocating. Cameron sliced his steak, refusing to meet my eyes. Natalie leaned forward, her voice laced with a sickly sweetness. She gently suggested that I go in for a general health checkup. She claimed I had been increasingly forgetful lately, leaving lights on and misplacing my reading glasses. She reached across the table and patted my hand, insisting it was just a precaution because they cared about my well-being so deeply. I did not flinch. I did not throw the plate at her face or demand to know about the casino debt. I simply offered her a warm, grateful smile. I thanked her for caring and agreed that my memory had not been the sharpest lately. I watched the triumphant glance she immediately shot at Cameron. They thought they had won. They thought I was a naive, compliant sheep walking willingly toward the slaughterhouse. But they had vastly underestimated the man sitting across from them. After dinner, I claimed exhaustion and retired to my bedroom. I waited until the house plunged into absolute silence. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2 a.m. I slipped out of bed and moved soundlessly back into my study. I reached into my personal toolkit and retrieved a micro-security camera I had purchased months ago for front porch surveillance. I carefully mounted it in the top corner of my bookshelf, hiding it perfectly behind a row of thick financial encyclopedias. I adjusted the lens until it pointed directly at the heavy steel floor safe hidden beneath my rug. The trap was set. Now I just needed my daughter to take the bait. The morning light poured through the kitchen windows, casting long, deceptive shadows across the hardwood floor. I poured my coffee, moving with the slow, deliberate shuffle they expected of a declining old man. Natalie sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone. Cameron was entirely absent, likely sleeping off the stress of his massive casino debt. I placed my ceramic mug in the sink. I patted my pockets with feigned confusion, letting out a frustrated sigh. I muttered that I had left my wallet in my study again, but I was too tired to go back for it. I announced I was just going for a short walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp Seattle air. I left the house entirely at their disposal. The bait was set. I did not stay in this neighborhood. I walked 4 blocks down to a small, unassuming diner I had frequented for years. The bell above the door jingled, announcing my arrival to the morning rush of commuters and tired waitresses. I slid into a corner booth facing the wall to ensure total privacy. I ordered a black coffee and waited until the waitress walked away. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. The emotional shock of the previous night had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I opened the secure surveillance application I had installed just hours earlier. The screen flickered, loading the feed from the micro camera hidden behind my financial encyclopedias. The view of my private study was crystal clear. For 10 minutes, the room remained an empty, silent sanctuary. I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in the reality of the moment. Then the heavy oak door creaked open. Natalie stepped into the frame. She did not knock. She did not hesitate. She glanced over her shoulder one last time before gently pushing the door shut until it clicked. She moved with a predatory grace, walking straight toward the center of the room. She knew exactly what she was looking for. I watched my daughter kneel on the vintage Persian rug, the same rug Caroline and I had purchased on our 10th anniversary. Natalie shoved the heavy fabric aside without a second thought at exposing the circular steel cover of my floor safe. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small brass key, the key she had stolen from my desk, the key I had deliberately left misplaced to test her boundaries. She inserted it into the lock and turned it. The heavy steel mechanism unlatched with a muted thud. A profound, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. Watching your own flesh and blood violate your most private sanctum is a pain that defies description. I had spent 30 years navigating the brutal, unforgiving landscape of corporate finance. I had missed school plays and family dinners to secure our future. I had built a fortress of financial security so my daughter would never know the anxiety of an empty bank account. Now she was using that very security to destroy me. Natalie reached deep into the steel cavity. She pulled out a stack of thick manila folders. I recognized them instantly. They contained the complete portfolio of my primary retirement accounts, my stock dividends, and the original deed to the house. She spread the documents out across the mahogany floor. She did not look at them with the respect of a daughter securing her father's legacy. She looked at them with the ravenous hunger of a scavenger picking over a carcass. She pulled out her smartphone. The flash of her camera illuminated the dim study as she rapidly took pictures of every single page. She captured my account numbers, my routing codes, my private passwords, and the contact information for my wealth management firm. She was extremely thorough. She captured everything they needed to seize control of my entire net worth. Cameron's gambling debt was a ticking time bomb, and my life's work was the ransom they intended to pay. I sat in the crowded diner entirely isolated in my private nightmare. The waitress returned to top off my coffee, asking if I needed anything else. I smiled warmly, thanked her, and said I was perfectly fine. I looked back at the screen. Natalie was meticulously restacking the manila folders. She placed them back into the safe, matching the exact order she had found them in. She locked the heavy steel door. She pulled the Persian rug back over the metal plate, smoothing out the fabric to erase any trace of her intrusion. She stood up, lipped my brass key back into her pocket, and walked out of the study. The door clicked shut. The room was empty once again. She believed she was a ghost. She believed she had executed a flawless infiltration. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to ruin her. I closed the surveillance application. I took a deep breath, preparing to stand up and begin the next phase of my retaliation. I needed to call Gideon Shaw. I needed to accelerate the timeline for selling the house. The plan was to move swiftly, quietly, and entirely within the bounds of the law. Before I could even unlock my phone screen to dial the lawyer's number, the device vibrated violently in my hand. A high-priority notification flashed across the top of the screen. It was an automated alert from my primary banking institution. I tapped the notification, opening the secure banking portal. The message was sterile, composed of cold digital text. It informed me that an expedited wire transfer had just been initiated from my main retirement checking account. The destination was an unrecognized offshore holding company. The amount was exactly $15,000. My blood ran ice cold. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. The $15,000 represented a massive, unauthorized breach of my secure funds. Natalie had not just taken pictures of my documents to prepare for the future. She and Cameron had already bypassed the secondary security protocols. They were testing the waters. They were draining the accounts to appease the casino syndicate right this very second. They were not simply planning to lock me in a neglected nursing home anymore. They had officially pulled the trigger. The theft had begun, and the war was no longer an approaching storm. It was actively crashing down upon my head. I placed a $20 bill on the diner table, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the street. The time for observation was completely over. The rain started coming down hard by the time I reached the financial district. I bypassed the receptionist at the law firm of Shaw and Associates and walked straight into the corner office. Gideon Shaw did not look up from his mahogany desk immediately. He was a man who measured his time in billable seconds. During my years as a senior analyst, Gideon was the corporate bulldog I unleashed when negotiations turned hostile. He respected cold numbers and despised polite chatter. That made him the exact ally I needed for this war. I tossed the printout of the $15,000 wire transfer onto his keyboard. I told him my daughter and her husband were draining my accounts and planning to seize my home. Gideon finally raised his eyes. He did not offer sympathy or empty apologies. He reached into a locked drawer, pulled out a thick gray file, and slid it across the desk toward me. He explained that he had already been looking into my son-in-law. Cameron was not just an arrogant fool. He was a desperate man, drowning in a lethal current. Gideon tapped a manicured finger against the file. He laid out the grim reality. Cameron had crossed the wrong people at a high-stakes underground casino. The total debt was $200,000, and the syndicate was no longer asking politely. The $15,000 wire I had just discovered was merely a penalty fee to buy them a few more weeks of oxygen. I opened the file. The pages were filled with photographs, bank statements, and court summons. Cameron was completely bankrupt. Natalie's boutique marketing agency had quietly folded 6 months ago. Their lavish lifestyle of designer clothes and European vacations was entirely funded by phantom credit and mounting lies. They had no assets. They had no savings. My house fully paid off, and sitting on prime real estate was their sole remaining lifeline. To them, my home was not a place of memories. It was a giant pile of cash waiting to be liquidated to save their own skin. I closed the folder. The betrayal was complete, documented in black and white. I told Gideon I wanted to lock them out of the accounts immediately. I wanted to report the wire transfer as fraud and throw them out of my house before the day ended. Gideon leaned back in his leather chair and shook his head. He warned me that reacting impulsively would trigger a legal catastrophe. He explained that if I kicked them out now, Natalie would simply weaponize her status as my daughter. She would claim I was suffering from sudden paranoia and elderly delusions. She would use the police confrontation as documented proof of my declining mental state. That is when Gideon delivered the final fatal piece of intelligence. He pulled a printed calendar from the folder and circled a date in red ink. He told me the threat was not a distant possibility. It was already in motion. Cameron had secured a corrupt psychiatrist on his payroll. This so-called doctor was scheduled to arrive at my house next Friday afternoon, under the guise of a routine wellness check. Gideon's voice grew dangerously quiet. He explained that this doctor specialized in fraudulent diagnoses. He would spend 15 minutes asking me basic questions, then sign a binding affidavit declaring me a danger to myself and completely incompetent to manage my own affairs. Once that paper was signed and filed with a sympathetic judge, my autonomy would evaporate. Natalie would be granted emergency conservatorship. She would gain immediate total control over my banking, my property, and my bodily freedom. I would be forcibly escorted to Shady Pines by the weekend, legally trapped with no voice and no rights. I stared at the red circle on the calendar. Friday. It was Saturday morning. The timeline was shockingly tight. Gideon folded his hands and looked at me with cold calculation. He stated that we had exactly 6 days. 6 days to outmaneuver 2 desperate people who were willing to destroy my life to save theirs. If the clock ran out, I would lose everything. The game was no longer about stopping a theft. It was a race for my absolute freedom. Gideon did not waste time offering me useless sympathy. He reached across his expansive mahogany desk and pressed a silver button on his intercom. He told his assistant to send her in. The heavy frosted glass door swung open, and a woman walked into the room with the precise, unyielding stride of an apex predator. Gideon introduced her as Monica. She was a private real estate acquisitions specialist. In corporate terms, she was a shark who preyed on distressed properties and desperate sellers. Today, her unique appetite was exactly what I required. Monica did not offer a polite greeting or a warm handshake. She took the seat next to me, crossed her legs, and laid a sleek leather portfolio on the table. She looked directly into my eyes and stated her terms with absolute clarity. She bought houses strictly in cash, bypassing banks' inspections and prolonged escrow periods. She could wire the funds into a secure, untraceable trust account within 48 hours. The catch was the price. She offered 20% below market value for the speed and discretion she provided. I did not blink. A minor financial loss was a completely acceptable casualty in this war for my freedom. However, Monica raised one manicured finger, signaling a strict, non-negotiable condition. She leaned closer and told me the transaction required a perfectly vacant property. The moment the funds cleared, her demolition and remodeling crews would take immediate possession. She demanded the house be entirely empty of occupants' furniture and personal liabilities. If anyone was inside the property when the 48-hour clock expired, the deal would instantly collapse. I nodded, slowly processing the logistical hurdle. I needed Natalie and Cameron out of the house. I needed a window of absolute vacancy to execute the sale, pack my belongings, and vanish before the fraudulent doctor ever set foot on my porch. Gideon watched me closely, asking how I planned to remove 2 hostile squatters from my own home without raising their suspicions. I told him I did not know yet, but I would find a way. We finalized the preliminary paperwork right there in Gideon's office. The loaded gun was now in my hand. I just needed a clear shot. I returned to my neighborhood as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the towering evergreens. I parked my car in the driveway and sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, staring at the beautiful brick facade of the home Caroline and I had built together. It was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, bracing myself for the suffocating atmosphere my daughter and her husband constantly manufactured. Instead of the usual tense silence, I was greeted by the upbeat rhythm of a jazz song playing from the kitchen speakers. The smell of roasted garlic and seared butter filled the hallway. I walked into the kitchen and found an unexpected scene. Cameron was actively pouring a rather expensive bottle of red wine into crystal glasses. Natalie was arranging artisan cheeses on a wooden cutting board. Her face was flushed with an intense, euphoric energy. She looked up and greeted me with a radiant, entirely fabricated smile. She urged me to sit down, claiming they had wonderful news to share with the family. I took my seat at the kitchen island, accepting the glass of wine Cameron slid across the granite counter. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression pleasantly confused. I asked them what the special occasion was. Natalie clapped her hands together, a gesture of pure theatrical joy. She announced that Cameron's firm had just rewarded him with a massive new client, and they were sending the 2 of them to Paris for a 2-week corporate retreat. She spun a beautiful, intricate lie about networking events, luxury hotels paid for by the company, and an exclusive opportunity they simply could not pass up. My financial analyst brain processed the information with lethal speed. There was no corporate retreat. Cameron was unemployed and drowning in casino debt. The luxury trip they were so gleefully celebrating was entirely funded by the $15,000 Natalie had stolen from my retirement account just hours prior. They were literally drinking wine bought with my blood and sweat, toasting to a vacation financed by my stolen future. They believed they had successfully bought the casino syndicate, a few weeks of patience, giving them the perfect excuse to flee the country and relax while their hired fraudulent doctor came to my house to destroy my life. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They intended to be sipping champagne beneath the Eiffel Tower at the exact moment I was being dragged away to a neglected nursing home. They wanted an airtight alibi. They wanted to return home 2 weeks later, play the shocked and devastated children, and legally take possession of my empty house. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the sparkling excitement in her eyes born from absolute malice and greed. I raised my wine glass and offered a warm, proud smile. I told her how incredibly happy I was for them. I praised Cameron for his hard work and told them they absolutely deserved a luxurious getaway. I promised them I would be perfectly fine holding down the fort while they were gone. I played the role of the supportive, oblivious father flawlessly. Natalie leaned over and kissed my cheek. She told me I was the best father in the world and promised to bring me back a souvenir from France. She mentioned their flight was scheduled to depart the very next morning at 8. They would be gone for exactly 14 days. I took a slow sip of the rich red wine. The flavor was bold and sharp. The logistical hurdle had just completely evaporated. I did not need to invent a reason to get them out of the house. Their own arrogant greed was escorting them directly out the front door. The golden window of opportunity had just swung wide open. The 48-hour countdown was officially set. I finished my wine and excused myself to my bedroom, claiming I wanted to let the young couple celebrate their success in private. I walked down the quiet hallway, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic purpose. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly where I needed them. Tomorrow morning, my daughter and her husband would board a flight to Paris, leaving my house completely empty. Tomorrow afternoon, Monica's real estate team would take possession of the property. And by the time the fraudulent doctor arrived on Friday, there would be no confused old man waiting for a psychiatric evaluation. There would be nothing but an empty house, locked doors, and a legally executed deed of sale. The trap was fully primed, and they were walking right into it. The morning air was thick with the suffocating scent of Natalie's expensive perfume, and the heavy thud of designer luggage hitting the hardwood floor. I stood by the front door wearing the oversized cardigan she had bought me for Christmas. I let my shoulders slump just enough to project absolute defeat. Cameron did not even offer a polite handshake. He merely checked his luxury watch, entirely focused on the private car waiting in the driveway. Natalie gave me a brief, sterile hug. She told me to remember to lock the doors and promised to call from Paris. Her eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any genuine affection. I smiled the warm, vacant smile of a man who did not know his own mind was supposedly slipping. I told them to have a wonderful trip and to enjoy every single moment. I watched from the porch as the driver loaded their stolen luxury into the trunk. The black town car pulled away, gliding down the manicured suburban street. I kept my hand raised in a slow, fragile wave until the vehicle turned the corner and disappeared from sight. The moment the brake lights vanished, the facade shattered. I dropped my hand. I straightened my spine, feeling the familiar razor-sharp clarity of my corporate years flood my veins. I stepped back inside and locked the heavy oak door. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single text message to Gideon Shaw. I typed that the house was clear and to send them in. Exactly 4 minutes later, a silver luxury vehicle and an unmarked white van pulled into my driveway. Monica stepped out first. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried an electronic tablet, projecting the lethal efficiency of a woman who destroyed properties for a living. Behind her, 3 men in steel-toed boots carrying specialized measurement lasers and clipboard portfolios marched toward my front door. I opened the door and let the invasion begin. There were no pleasantries. Monica walked past me, immediately dispatching her team to different sectors of the house. They moved like a tactical military unit. One man went straight to the roof. Another began scanning the plumbing and electrical panels. The lead structural engineer, a burly man named Davis, descended into the lower level of the house. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the sharp beeps of laser measures and heavy boots echoing against the floorboards. I stood in the kitchen feeling a profound sense of vindication. I was preparing to sell the walls that held decades of memories, but I felt absolutely nothing except a deep driving need for total retribution. The quiet efficiency of the operation shattered when Davis marched heavily up the basement stairs. His face was flushed and his jaw was set in a tight, angry line. He signaled Monica to follow him back down to the lower level. I trailed close behind them, sensing the immediate shift in the atmosphere. Davis pointed his high-powered flashlight toward the expansive entertainment room Cameron had insisted on building 2 years ago. I clearly remembered Cameron tearing down walls with his arrogant friends, claiming an open concept would revolutionize the space and increase the home equity. Davis shined the bright beam directly onto the exposed ceiling joists above the drop ceiling. He did not mince words. He told Monica that the structural integrity of the entire western wing was severely compromised. Cameron had completely removed a primary load-bearing wall to make room for his custom billiard table. The engineer explained that the ceiling was actively sagging under the weight of the upper floor. The massive structure was resting on nothing but cosmetic drywall and cheap decorative wooden beams. It was a catastrophic amateur mistake that threatened the entire foundation of the property. Monica's expression hardened into a mask of pure ice. She turned to me, tapping her stylus against her tablet with an aggressive rhythm. She stated that a compromised load-bearing wall was a massive financial liability. She explained that her cash offers were strictly contingent on structural soundness. Repairing that kind of foundational damage required city permits, specialized contractors, and tens of thousands of dollars in emergency reinforcement. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. She declared that the house was entirely unsafe for her demolition crews to gut. She told me she could not assume this level of risk and was pulling her $950,000 offer off the table. The deal was officially dead. Monica's declaration hung in the dusty, stagnant air of the basement. The deal was officially dead. She turned her back on me, signaling her structural engineer to pack up his laser measuring tools. Her expensive leather heels clicked sharply against the concrete floor as she walked toward the wooden staircase. For a fraction of a second, the suffocating reality of the situation threatened to crush me. A normal father would have panicked. A normal man would have collapsed under the weight of his son-in-law's devastating incompetence. The shattered load-bearing wall was a physical manifestation of Cameron's arrogant stupidity, and it was about to cost me my absolute freedom. But I could not afford to act like a normal father. I banished the rising tide of anxiety and summoned the cold, razor-sharp discipline of a man who had spent 30 years surviving the brutal landscape of corporate finance. I calculated the variables with lethal speed. I had leverage. I had a desperate buyer masquerading as an indifferent shark. I stepped smoothly in front of the staircase, physically blocking her exit. I kept my posture entirely relaxed, and my voice devoid of any emotional desperation. I told Monica to send her engineer outside and give me exactly 2 minutes of her time. She paused on the bottom step. Her predatory instincts flared, evaluating my sudden shift in demeanor. She gave a curt nod to the burly engineer. He marched heavily up the wooden stairs, the heavy basement door clicking shut behind him. We were completely alone. I did not appeal to her humanity. Sharks do not respond to bleeding hearts or tales of family betrayal. They respond exclusively to blood in the water. I laid out the raw mathematics of the situation. I openly acknowledged that the compromised load-bearing wall was a severe liability. I told her I knew the permitting, the specialized labor, and the steel support beams required to brace the upper floor would cost anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000. It was a massive logistical headache for an average buyer. But Monica was not an average buyer. She was a professional liquidator with a vast network of private contractors. I offered her a brutal, clean compromise. I told her I would drop the asking price by exactly $50,000, $900,000 flat. That discount entirely covered the estimated structural repairs and handed her a generous $10,000 premium purely for the inconvenience. In exchange, I demanded two non-negotiable terms. First, her firm would assume all structural liabilities immediately with zero inspection contingencies holding up the process. Second, the cash had to hit my secure offshore trust account by midnight tonight. Monica stared at me in the dim light of the basement. The silence between us was absolute. I could practically hear the gears turning in her mind as she calculated the profit margins. I knew her contracting crews worked cheaply and rapidly. She could fix Cameron's reckless mistake for half the price I had just quoted her. She would pocket the difference, fix the wall, and flip the house for a massive gain. I was handing her a highly lucrative margin on a silver platter, provided she moved with blinding immediate speed. A slow, sharp smile broke across her face. She recognized a fellow predator. She did not bother trying to haggle me down further. She knew I had correctly priced the risk. She extended her hand. We shook on it. Her grip was firm and unyielding, sealing a pact of mutual self-interest forged in the ruins of my family home. We walked upstairs to the kitchen. Her legal team operated with military efficiency. They had a portable laser printer running in the back of their unmarked van. Within 20 minutes, a newly revised stack of dense legal contracts was placed directly on my heavy oak dining table. It was the exact same table where Caroline and I had shared our morning coffee for 3 decades. It was the same table where my daughter and her husband had sat just last night, sipping expensive wine while silently plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my legacy. I picked up the heavy brass pen. I did not rush. I read every single clause, every fine print addendum, and every liability waiver with microscopic attention. I ensured there were absolutely no loopholes that could tether me to this property once the money cleared. Monica stood by the granite kitchen island watching me silently as I signed my name across the dotted lines. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving a permanent blue trail on the crisp white paper. With every signature, I severed a heavy, suffocating tie to the past. I was amputating an infected limb to save the rest of my body. I signed away the brick fireplace. I signed away the backyard garden. I signed away the very roof over my head. Monica collected the final page and slid the entire stack into her leather portfolio. She pulled out her mobile device and sent a coded message to her banking liaison. She looked up and confirmed the wire transfer had been initiated. The funds would reflect in my secure trust account within the hour. She then delivered a final, chilling reminder. Her demolition crews would arrive precisely 48 hours from this exact minute. If so much as a single photograph, a forgotten coat, or a stray piece of mail remained inside these walls, her men would throw it directly into an industrial dumpster. The house belonged to her now. I assured her the property would be completely vacant long before her trucks pulled into the driveway. She turned and walked out the front door. The heavy latch clicked shut. I stood completely alone in the spacious foyer. The house was officially no longer mine. A profound, hollow silence settled over the empty rooms. The phantom weight of property taxes, maintenance, and sentimental attachment simply vanished from my shoulders. I had successfully executed the hardest financial transaction of my entire life. I had cut the anchor before it could drag me to the bottom of the ocean. I walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of cold water to soothe my dry throat. The adrenaline of the negotiation was slowly beginning to recede, leaving a cold, focused energy in its wake. I needed to start packing my essential documents. I needed to call Gideon Shaw to confirm the money had arrived safely. Before I could even set my glass down on the counter, my smartphone vibrated violently against my ribs. It was not a gentle notification. It was a sustained, aggressive buzzing that demanded immediate attention. I pulled the device from my pocket. It was a high-priority Level 1 security alert from my primary platinum credit card provider. The screen glowed brightly in the dim hallway, displaying a pending authorization request. The geographic location attached to the transaction was a luxury designer boutique located directly on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in Paris. The requested amount was exactly $20,000. My breath caught in my throat. Natalie had not even waited 24 hours. She had barely stepped off her international flight. She was standing in a high-end French boutique, attempting to casually swipe away a fortune on designer handbags and luxury clothing. She thought she was spending the endless, unguarded resources of a confused old man she had successfully managed to manipulate. She believed the vault doors were wide open and the alarms were turned off. She had absolutely no idea the locks had just been changed. The battlefield had instantly shifted from physical real estate to digital assets, and she had just handed me the coordinates for a devastating counterattack. The digital alert glowed with a cold blue light against the dark mahogany of the kitchen island. I stared at the screen of my smartphone, watching the numbers settle into my reality. The notification from my primary wealth management institution detailed a pending charge of exactly $20,000. The location was a world-famous designer boutique situated on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in the heart of Paris. Natalie and Cameron had barely touched down in Europe. They had likely dropped their stolen luggage at a luxury hotel and immediately marched out to celebrate their supposed victory. I pictured my daughter standing in that pristine French boutique, surrounded by gilded mirrors and fawning sales assistants. I imagined the complimentary glass of champagne resting in her hand while she casually attempted to swipe away my life savings for designer handbags and silk garments. She felt completely untouchable. She believed the vault was wide open and the solitary guard was fast asleep. Her arrogance was genuinely breathtaking. She did not even attempt to hide the transaction by breaking it down into smaller, less noticeable amounts. She struck with the blunt force of absolute entitlement. For decades, I had quietly managed my financial portfolio, building a fortress of security through discipline and relentless hard work. Every dollar represented hours of my life, sacrifices made, and vacations delayed. Now Natalie viewed my entire existence as a bottomless cash dispenser, ready to fund her delusions of grandeur. She assumed I was a senile, defeated old man sitting in an empty house waiting obediently for the corrupt doctor they had hired to strip away my freedom. She thought the war was already won. She had absolutely no idea the battlefield had shifted. I could have simply tapped the screen to decline the transaction. I could have temporarily blocked the card and forced her to call me with some fabricated excuse. But a temporary block was merely a bandage on a severed artery. I needed to cut the blood supply entirely. I needed to ensure they could never access a single cent of my legacy again. I unlocked my phone and bypassed the standard banking application. I dialed the direct executive line from my wealth management firm. The automated system recognized my number and immediately routed me to a senior fraud specialist. A man named Arthur answered the line with a calm, professional tone. I provided my full name, my secure identification code, and my verbal authorization password. I spoke with the steady, measured cadence of a corporate director executing a hostile takeover. I informed Arthur that my account was currently experiencing a massive, unauthorized breach from an international location. He pulled up my file and confirmed the pending $20,000 charge in Paris. He also noted several smaller, rapid transactions that had occurred at the airport and a luxury car rental agency. I stated clearly and unequivocally that I did not authorize any of those charges. I declared them entirely fraudulent. Arthur offered to immediately cancel the compromised card and issue a replacement, assuming it was a simple case of a stolen number. I stopped him. I told him this was not a random theft by an anonymous hacker. I instructed him to open a formal, legally binding investigation for financial fraud. I named my daughter Natalie and my son-in-law Cameron as the perpetrators. I explained that they had illicitly gained access to my secondary security protocols and were attempting to drain my primary retirement funds across international borders. The atmosphere on the line shifted instantly. Arthur informed me that filing a direct fraud report against family members would trigger an immediate federal banking freeze. It would permanently lock every single account, credit line, and joint asset associated with their names under my portfolio. I told him that was exactly what I wanted. I gave him the explicit verbal authorization to execute the total freeze. The digital guillotine dropped with absolute precision. Arthur confirmed the protocol was active. In a matter of seconds, the entire financial bridge connecting Natalie to my wealth was incinerated. Every credit card she carried in her designer purse was transformed into a worthless piece of plastic. The emergency travel funds Cameron relied upon were instantly blocked. Any joint checking accounts they had previously manipulated were frozen pending a criminal investigation. Their financial oxygen was completely shut off. I thanked Arthur for his swift assistance and ended the call. I stood in the silence of my foyer and visualized the exact moment the reality would hit them. I pictured Natalie standing at the marble checkout counter in Paris, offering her polished smile to the cashier. I imagined the slight frown on the cashier face as the terminal flashed a bright red decline notification. Natalie would likely offer an embarrassed laugh, blaming it on a bank error caused by international travel. She would reach into her purse and hand over a secondary card. That card would also decline. The polite smiles of the boutique staff would slowly evaporate, replaced by cold suspicion. Cameron would step forward, pulling out his own wallet, trying to salvage their dignity. His cards, tethered to the same frozen network, would meet the exact same fate. In a matter of minutes, they would be politely escorted out of the store empty-handed and entirely humiliated. But the humiliation at the boutique would only be the beginning of their nightmare. They were stranded thousands of miles from home in one of the most expensive cities on the planet. They had no access to cash. They had no functioning credit. The luxury hotel where they had booked their 2-week stay would soon attempt to authorize the daily deposit. When that authorization failed, they would be locked out of their suite. The rental car agency would demand immediate return of the vehicle. They had planned a lavish 2-week Parisian vacation, funded by stolen money, intended to serve as a perfect alibi while they destroyed my life back home. Now that same vacation had become their very own prison. They were entirely isolated, bankrupt, and trapped on a different continent. I turned my attention back to my immediate surroundings. The house was completely quiet, save for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Monica and her real estate team were scheduled to arrive with their demolition crews in less than 48 hours. I walked into my study and opened my leather travel bag. I packed only the absolute essentials. I gathered my passport, my private ledgers, my secure hard drives, and a few small photographs of Caroline that held genuine emotional value. I left the expensive suits and the heavy furniture behind. None of it mattered anymore. The physical structure of this house was no longer a home. It was simply the bait I had used to trap 2 greedy scavengers. I zipped the travel bag shut and slung it over my shoulder. I walked into the kitchen and placed the heavy brass house keys directly in the center of the granite island, exactly where Monica had requested. As I turned toward the front door, my smartphone began to vibrate inside my coat pocket. It was a long, sustained vibration that signaled an incoming international call. I pulled the device out and looked at the glowing screen. The name Natalie Paris flashed in bright white letters against the dark background. The digital panic had officially reached my shores. I let the phone vibrate in my palm. I did not answer. The call dropped, but the screen immediately lit up again. It was Cameron this time. His call was followed by a frantic succession of text messages. The preview banners illuminated my screen, displaying broken, desperate sentences, demanding to know what was happening with the accounts and begging me to call the bank to clear up the supposed misunderstanding. The vibration pulsed through my hand like the frantic heartbeat of a dying animal. They were standing in the middle of a foreign city, finally realizing that the foundation of their entire existence had just crumbled to dust beneath their feet. The arrogant confidence they had displayed just hours ago was completely gone, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. They were begging the senile old man they had planned to lock away to save them from their own ruin. I stared at the flashing name on the screen for a long, quiet moment. I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I felt only the profound, satisfying weight of absolute justice. I offered the glowing screen a calm, silent smile. I pressed my thumb against the power button and held it down until the screen went completely black. The vibration ceased. The connection was permanently severed. I opened the front door, stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, and walked away from the house without ever looking back. The sharp, defining sound of tearing packing tape echoed through the empty hallway. It was a harsh, rhythmic noise that signaled the absolute end of an era. I stood by the front window watching a team of professional movers carry the final cardboard boxes out to their idling truck. They moved with a quiet, respectful efficiency, unaware of the profound betrayal that had necessitated their services. I had hired them just hours prior, paying a massive premium for emergency, same-day extraction. They carried away those last remnants of my genuine life. They carried the framed photograph of Caroline that used to sit on the mantel, the vintage leather armchair where I had spent decades reading financial reports, and the antique wooden clock that had kept the rhythm of this household for 30 years. As the men secured the back of the moving truck, the house behind me felt completely hollow. Stripped of my possessions, the structure lost all its warmth, reverting to mere drywall, timber, and glass. I felt a brief passing ghost of sorrow, a natural mourning for the sanctuary I had built to protect my family. But the sorrow was instantly incinerated by the cold, protective armor I now wore. This building was no longer my home. It was a liquidated asset, a weapon deployed to trap the two parasites currently stranded on another continent. Before the moving truck had even turned the corner at the end of the street, Monica's tactical construction crew arrived. 3 unmarked white cargo vans pulled into the driveway, their tires crunching loudly over the gravel. The heavy side doors slid open, and a dozen men poured out carrying heavy industrial equipment, rolls of thick wire, and boxes of heavy steel hardware. There was no hesitation. They did not knock. The house legally belonged to their employer now, and they were here to secure her investment with brutal precision. I watched from the kitchen as the transformation began. It was not a renovation. It was a militarization. 2 men immediately approached the heavy oak front door. The brass deadbolt, the one I had carefully locked every night to keep my daughter safe when she was a child, was violently drilled out. The high-pitched screech of grinding metal filled the foyer. Metal shavings rained down onto the hardwood floor. Within minutes, the old locks were completely hollowed out and replaced with reinforced industrial-grade steel cores. They were the kind of heavy-duty mechanisms used to secure bank vaults and commercial warehouses. The invasion spread rapidly to every corner of the property. Men on ladders worked beneath the eaves of the roof, mounting sleek black security cameras that stared down at the driveway with unblinking red eyes. They were motion-activated infrared lenses connected directly to a private security firm. Other technicians moved from window to window, applying thick layers of shatterproof film to the glass and installing high-decibel alarm sensors on every single frame. If anyone attempted to force a window or bypass a lock, a deafening siren would immediately trigger and armed private security would be dispatched within 3 minutes. The most visceral part of the erasure happened outside on the driveway. A massive rusted steel dumpster had been dropped onto the concrete by a flatbed truck. Monica's terms had been absolute. The house had to be entirely vacant, stripped of all personal liabilities. My belongings were safe in the moving truck, heading toward a secure storage facility. But Natalie and Cameron had left their entire lives behind, trusting that they would return from their fraudulent Parisian getaway to seamlessly resume their luxurious, stolen existence. I stood on the porch and watched Monica's crew empty the master bedroom. They moved without a single ounce of care or respect for the expensive, curated lifestyle my daughter and her husband had built on my dime. Cameron's custom-made golf clubs, purchased with money he claimed he needed for a business venture, were tossed carelessly over the high metal rim of the dumpster. They landed with a hollow metallic clatter. Natalie's collection of designer shoes, her expensive silk pillows, and the custom-tailored suits Cameron wore to project the illusion of success followed immediately after. The workers dragged the heavy imported rugs down the stairs and hurled them into the trash. They threw away the expensive espresso machine, the crystal wine glasses, and the high-end electronics. I watched the physical manifestation of their arrogance being reduced to literal garbage. They had viewed me as a disposable burden, an old man to be discarded in a forgotten facility so they could feast on the remains of my wealth. Now the universe was reflecting their cruelty right back at them. Everything they valued, everything they used to define their superficial worth was currently sitting at the bottom of a steel dumpster, waiting to be hauled away to a municipal landfill. The erasure was total, clean, and utterly merciless. The foreman of the crew approached me on the porch. He wiped his hands on a rough canvas rag and handed me a clipboard. He informed me that the perimeter was fully secured, the locks were changed, and the internal sensors were armed. He stated that the property was now entirely locked down under Monica's corporate holdings. He needed my final signature to confirm the handover. I took his pen and signed my name with steady, deliberate strokes. I handed the clipboard back, thanking him for his efficiency. I walked down the steps of the porch toward my car. The atmosphere around me was beginning to shift dramatically. The crisp, clear air of the Seattle morning had vanished. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly, creating a heavy, suffocating weight in the air. I looked up at the sky over the Puget Sound. A massive wall of bruised charcoal gray clouds was rolling in from the Pacific Ocean, swallowing the sunlight and casting deep, ominous shadows across the neighborhood. The wind began to pick up, whipping the branches of the tall, evergreen trees back and forth. A major storm was brewing, one of the violent, relentless downpours that occasionally battered the coastline. I opened the driver's side door of my vehicle, but I paused. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small pad of yellow paper and a black ink pen. I wrote a single brief sentence. I did not write a long, emotional letter detailing my heartbreak or my anger. I did not demand apologies or offer explanations. Explanations were for people who still cared. I simply wrote the cold, indisputable truth of their new reality. I walked back up the steps of the porch. The wind tugged sharply at my coat. I pressed the yellow paper against the thick, reinforced glass of the newly fortified front door. I smoothed the edges down, ensuring it would remain firmly in place. The note simply read that the house had been sold, all previous keys were disabled, and trespassers would be aggressively prosecuted. I turned my back on the fortress. I got into my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway just as the first heavy drops of freezing rain began to smash against my windshield. I drove away, leaving the neighborhood behind, completely untethered and entirely free. Natalie and Cameron were currently trapped in Paris, their credit cards declining. Their hotel room locked, their entire world collapsing in real time. Eventually, the reality of their bankruptcy would force them back. They would likely face deportation or beg their way onto a return flight, desperate to reach the only safe haven they believed they had left. But they would not find a warm house or a vulnerable old man waiting to be manipulated. They would arrive in the middle of a brutal, freezing Seattle storm. They would stand shivering on the driveway, staring up at a locked, impenetrable fortress, surrounded by security cameras, with all their worldly possessions rotting in a landfill. The storm was already breaking overhead, promising a truly devastating homecoming for the traitors. 10 days had passed since I walked away from my old life. I sat in the quiet comfort of my new downtown condominium, a cup of hot black coffee resting on the glass table beside me. The Seattle sky had fulfilled its dark promise, unleashing a relentless, punishing rainstorm that had washed the streets gray and flooded the gutters. I opened the secure surveillance application on my tablet. Monica had granted me temporary access to the exterior camera feeds of the property as a professional courtesy. I watched the high-definition stream of the driveway through the static of the heavy rain. The stage was set, and the actors were about to arrive. Through the curtain of the downpour, a yellow taxi slowly turned onto the familiar suburban street. It stopped abruptly at the base of the driveway, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The camera audio picked up the muffled, angry shouts echoing from inside the vehicle. The driver stepped out into the freezing rain, pointing aggressively at his digital payment terminal. Cameron emerged a moment later, drenched instantly by the storm, waving his hands in a frantic defensive gesture. Natalie followed, clutching her ruined designer coat around her shoulders. They were arguing bitterly over the fare. I watched as Cameron frantically swiped card after card, only to be met with the same glowing red light of rejection. The global financial freeze I had initiated was holding strong. He finally shoved his expensive luxury watch into the driver's chest, a desperate barter to settle the debt. The taxi driver grabbed the watch, threw their heavy waterlogged luggage onto the wet concrete, and sped away, splashing dark water over Natalie's expensive leather boots. They stood shivering in the driveway, entirely abandoned. The luxurious Parisian vacation they had funded with my stolen retirement money had clearly ended in a catastrophic eviction. They looked exhausted, starved, and utterly defeated. Cameron grabbed the heavy suitcases, struggling to drag them up the steep incline of the driveway. Natalie walked behind him, her posture crumpled, her face smeared with ruined makeup. They were desperate for the warmth of the house, desperate for the sanctuary they believed they still owned. They pushed past the decorative shrubs, completely oblivious to the sleek black cameras tracking their every move. They dragged their burdens up the wooden steps of the front porch, seeking shelter under the awning. Cameron dropped the bags and dug into his soaked pockets. He pulled out the familiar brass key, the same key he had used to confidently enter my home and violate my privacy for the past 3 years. He stepped up to the heavy oak door and shoved the key toward the cylinder. His hand stopped. The camera captured his profound confusion. He leaned in closer, wiping the freezing rain from his eyes. The old familiar lock was completely gone. In its place sat a massive industrial-grade steel core, gleaming coldly in the dim porch light. He tried to force the key into the narrow slot, twisting and pushing with rising panic. The brass metal simply scraped against the impenetrable steel surface. The lock refused to yield. Cameron grabbed the heavy door handle and pulled with all his remaining strength, but the reinforced door did not budge a single millimeter. It was a solid wall of absolute rejection. Natalie stepped forward, her voice rising in a shrill, hysterical pitch, demanding to know what was wrong. She hit the wooden frame with her bare hands, urging him to force it open. That is when Cameron finally looked up. Taped securely behind the thick, shatterproof glass of the door was a single piece of yellow notepad paper. I watched Cameron lean forward, his nose almost touching the cold glass, as his eyes tracked the handwritten words. I had kept the message brief, sharp, and entirely devoid of emotion. I had written that the nursing home was completely full. I had informed them that this house officially had a new owner. I ended the message by instructing them to contact the law firm of Gideon Shaw to retrieve whatever garbage remained of their belongings. I watched the exact second Cameron's mind shattered. He stepped back from the door, his hands dropping limply to his sides. He looked at Natalie, his face a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. He pointed a trembling finger at the yellow paper. Natalie shoved him aside and pressed her face against the glass. She read the words, her eyes widening as the realization washed over her like a physical blow. The secure fortress they had planned to steal had been sold out from under them. The money was gone. The house was gone. The senile old man they had tried to lock away had orchestrated their absolute ruin while they were busy sipping champagne in France. Natalie fell to her knees on the wet wooden boards of the porch. She threw her head back and unleashed a piercing primal scream that tore through the sound of the torrential rain. It was a sound of pure agony, the devastating wail of a predator caught helplessly in its own trap. She pounded her fists against the reinforced glass in a blind, violent rage. That physical impact was the final trigger. The intelligent security system Monica had installed registered the assault on the property. Instantly, a deafening high decibel alarm erupted from the eaves of the roof, drowning out the storm and echoing fiercely down the street. Blinding red and white strobe lights engaged, flashing aggressively across the porch and illuminating their terrified faces. They covered their ears, stumbling backward over their ruined luggage in complete shock. At the exact same moment, the bright headlights of a neighborhood private security patrol vehicle swung sharply into the driveway, cutting through the heavy rain. The vehicle accelerated up the incline, its tires screeching to a halt, completely blocking their only path of escape. The doors of the patrol car swung open, and two armed guards stepped out into the storm, shining heavy tactical flashlights directly into Cameron and Natalie's eyes. The blinding beams of the tactical flashlights pinned Cameron and Natalie against the reinforced steel of the front door like escaped convicts. The heavy rain slanted across the brilliant shafts of light, creating a chaotic curtain of silver water. Two security officers stepped out of the patrol vehicle. They were not local neighborhood watch volunteers or standard residential guards. They were heavily armed private contractors hired directly by Monica. Their black rain gear repelled the storm as they approached the porch with practiced military precision. Cameron raised a trembling hand to shield his eyes from the glare. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the arrogant authority of a successful corporate executive. He demanded that they lower their flashlights, claiming that this was his family home and they were simply having a frustrating issue with the front lock. The lead security officer did not lower his flashlight. He kept the intense beam fixed squarely on Cameron's pale, dripping face. He stated in a flat, unyielding voice that this property was legally owned by a private real estate holding firm. He informed them that they were currently trespassing on a secured corporate asset and triggering a high-level security perimeter. Natalie pushed her way past Cameron, entirely incapable of processing the rejection. Her expensive designer clothes were plastered to her skin, completely ruined by the freezing Seattle downpour. Her meticulously styled hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face. She pointed an accusing, trembling finger at the officer. She shrieked that the house belonged to her father, Douglas, and that the security guards were making a massive, highly illegal mistake. She demanded that they unlock the door immediately so she could get inside out of the cold and call her team of lawyers. The officer remained entirely motionless. He did not argue. He reached inside his waterproof tactical jacket and produced a laminated legal document. He held it up under the harsh porch light. It was the officially executed deed of sale, fully filed with the city, alongside a strict no trespassing order signed by a municipal judge. He read the explicit terms aloud over the roar of the storm. He advised them to step off the porch, collect their belongings, and return to the public sidewalk immediately. Natalie's mind simply could not grasp the absolute finality of the situation. Her pristine world of stolen wealth and unearned luxury had completely vanished in the blink of an eye. She lunged forward, her hands curling into tight fists. She slammed them against the thick, shatterproof glass of the newly installed front door. She screamed that it was her house, her rightful inheritance, and her money. She threatened to smash the glass into pieces if they did not open the door and let her inside her own home. The second security officer calmly unclipped the radio from his tactical belt. He did not engage in a shouting match with a hysterical woman. He simply pressed the transmission button and requested immediate police backup for a hostile trespassing situation in progress. The sound of approaching sirens pierced the heavy rain just moments later. Red and blue lights reflected off the wet asphalt, painting the quiet suburban neighborhood in chaotic, violent colors. A local county sheriff cruiser pulled rapidly into the driveway, blocking the private security vehicle. The sheriff stepped out into the storm, pulling the collar of his jacket up against the wind. I recognized him instantly from my years of living in the community. He was a man who respected the law deeply and utterly despised entitled wealthy disturbances. The sheriff marched up the driveway and approached the porch, his hand resting casually on his heavy utility belt. Cameron tried to intercept him, launching into a desperate, frantic explanation. He stuttered through a fabricated story about a simple family misunderstanding, claiming that his elderly father-in-law had lost his mind and accidentally locked them out. The sheriff cut him off entirely with a raised hand. He turned to the security team and reviewed the laminated deed of sale. He looked at the bright yellow notepad paper I had left securely taped to the inside of the glass. Then he looked back at the two soaking wet, miserable figures standing on the porch. The sheriff spoke with absolute, crushing authority. He told them the property records were crystal clear and legally binding. The house belonged to a private corporation. He warned Cameron and Natalie that they had exactly 60 seconds to gather their bags and vacate the private premises. If they remained on the property for 1 second longer, he promised he would arrest them both for criminal trespassing and intentional property damage. The immediate threat of cold steel handcuffs finally broke through Natalie's hysterical delusion. She looked at the stern face of the sheriff, her jaw trembling violently, waiting for a magical reprieve that would never come. Cameron grabbed her roughly by the arm, pulling her down the wooden steps and away from the glowing porch light. They gathered their heavy, waterlogged designer suitcases from the concrete driveway. The wheels of their luggage dragged loudly through the deep puddles. They marched away through the freezing rain, their expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet pavement. They had to walk all the way down the long, dark street, permanently banished from the neighborhood they had once viewed as their personal bank account. I watched the entire pathetic sequence unfold through the high-definition security feed from the comfort of my dry, warm condominium. The absolute erasure of their presence from my property was a masterpiece of legal and financial precision. They walked for over a mile in the relentless downpour until they reached a busy commercial intersection on the edge of the city limits. They stood shivering under the flickering neon sign of a cheap highway motel. It was a miserable, decaying concrete building, surrounded by broken asphalt and rusted wire fences, the kind of neglected establishment that rented rooms by the hour to desperate people. Cameron walked into the dimly lit lobby, leaving Natalie shivering violently outside under a dripping metal awning. He approached the thick, bulletproof glass of the reception desk. Every single one of his platinum credit cards had been aggressively declined by the global financial freeze I had initiated. He was entirely bankrupt. He was forced to dig deep into the hidden lining of his soaked briefcase, pulling out a crumpled wad of emergency cash he had desperately hidden from the casino syndicate. It was barely enough paper money to secure a single night in a damp, reeking room on the ground floor facing the noisy highway. I watched the digital tracking marker linked to their shared cellular plan come to a complete halt at that miserable highway address. They were locked inside a cheap motel room with peeling wallpaper, stained carpets, and a malfunctioning heater. They had absolutely no access to their bank accounts, no legal claim to any property, and a mounting mountain of catastrophic, life-threatening debt waiting for them when the sun came up. They had attempted to strip me of my dignity, steal my life savings, and lock me away in a forgotten medical facility. Now they were the ones discarded on the side of a cold highway, entirely ruined by their own monumental greed. I closed the secure surveillance application on my tablet, took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my hot coffee, and listened to the comforting sound of the heavy rain washing my slate completely clean. The morning sun cut sharply through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Shaw and Associates, casting long geometric shadows across the polished mahogany of the conference table. I sat completely still at the head of the room, cradling a porcelain cup of black coffee. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving the Seattle skyline washed clean and brilliant. In stark contrast to the pristine environment of this high-end legal firm, I knew the two people currently ascending in the private elevator had spent the night enduring a brutal, freezing reality. My attorney Gideon Shaw sat to my immediate right. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and tailored wool, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture radiating the quiet, lethal confidence of a predator in his own territory. To my left sat Officer Miller, a veteran fraud detective with the Financial Crimes Division of the Seattle Police Department. He sat with his arms crossed over his dark uniform, his expression completely unreadable. We were not waiting to negotiate a settlement. We were waiting to execute a trap. The receptionist had called up on the secure line just 3 minutes prior, her voice tight with professional concern. She warned Gideon that two highly agitated individuals were in the lobby loudly demanding an immediate audience and refusing to wait. Gideon had simply instructed her to let them through. The sound of their arrival echoed down the long carpeted hallway long before they reached the room. Natalie was practically screaming at a paralegal, demanding immediate legal injunctions, shouting wild accusations of elder abuse, and claiming a massive financial fraud had been perpetrated against her family. Cameron's voice rumbled beneath hers, threatening to sue the entire firm, promising to have my assets permanently frozen and my mental capacity evaluated by an emergency court order. They were operating on pure, frantic adrenaline. They had survived a miserable night in a decaying roadside motel, entirely bankrupt and stripped of their dignity, and their only remaining survival strategy was arrogant, blinding intimidation. The heavy oak double doors of the conference room were shoved open with violent, reckless force. They slammed against the rubber wall stops, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Natalie marched in first, and the sight of her was almost tragic. Her expensive designer clothing thoroughly ruined by the torrential rain, and a night spent on a stained motel mattress clung awkwardly to her frame. Her meticulously maintained aesthetic was completely shattered. Her makeup was entirely washed away, revealing the pale, exhausted reality of a woman who had finally hit a concrete wall she could not buy her way through. Cameron followed closely behind her, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled and smelling faintly of damp wool and cheap highway exhaust. His face was flushed red with desperate rage. Natalie did not even look at the table initially. Her eyes locked entirely on Gideon. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at his face and shrieked that he was an active accomplice to a massive criminal fraud. She demanded that he immediately reverse the sale of the house, unfreeze her credit lines, and surrender the remaining funds from my offshore accounts before she called the authorities. Cameron puffed out his chest, stepping forward to back her up with fabricated authority. He declared that they had already contacted a top-tier legal team, a blatant lie, given their absolute lack of financial resources, and that I was going to be locked in a secure psychiatric ward by the end of the week for orchestrating this delusional, illegal stunt. I did not interrupt their frantic performance. I simply set my coffee cup down on its saucer. The soft, precise clink of the porcelain cut right through their hysterical shouting. Natalie's eyes finally tracked across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. She saw Gideon sitting with absolute, unbothered stillness. She saw me sitting perfectly upright at the head of the table wearing a crisp charcoal suit, my hands folded calmly before me, and then her eyes landed on the silver badge, the heavy utility belt, and the dark uniform of Officer Miller. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. Cameron froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. His arrogant posture collapsed in a fraction of a second, his shoulders slumping as the absolute gravity of the room finally registered in his desperate mind. The sheer terror of realization washed over them. They were not walking into a negotiation to reclaim their stolen wealth. They had willingly marched directly into a secured, heavily fortified legal ambush. The silence in the conference room was absolute. I looked at the two strangers standing before me, people I had once loved, people I had once considered my own flesh and blood. I told them to take a seat. My voice did not echo with anger, sadness, or vindictiveness. It was the flat, precise tone of a corporate liquidator permanently closing a bankrupt account. Neither of them moved. They stood paralyzed by the open doorway, staring with wide, terrified eyes at the police officer. Gideon adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat, commanding the space with effortless authority. He informed them that they were operating under a severe misunderstanding regarding the nature of this meeting. He stated clearly that my residential property had been legally liquidated, the funds were legally secured in an offshore trust, and they had absolutely no standing to contest a real estate transaction executed by a fully competent independent adult. Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He tried to summon a fraction of his previous bravado, though his voice shook noticeably. He stammered that they were going to prove I was not legally competent, that I had been acting erratically and dangerously, and that they had a doctor willing to testify under oath to my severe mental decline. Gideon offered a cold, entirely humorless smile. He reached for the heavy leather briefcase resting on the table beside him. The brass latches clicked sharply in the quiet room. He opened the lid and pulled out 3 thick, tightly bound legal dossiers. He slid them across the polished mahogany surface, pushing them until they rested directly in front of Natalie and Cameron's trembling hands. Gideon folded his hands on the table and leaned forward. He explained that they were completely mistaken about the purpose of this summons. The documents resting in front of them had absolutely nothing to do with my real estate portfolio, my financial trust, or my mental health. He reached out and tapped the cover of the first file. He announced that this dossier contained the complete time-stamped transaction, history, IP logs, and digital signatures, proving they had fraudulently opened 5 secondary credit cards using my personal social security number. He moved his hand and tapped the second file. He stated that this folder contained the recorded phone calls and bank security logs, proving Cameron had attempted to illegally wire transfer international funds from my primary retirement account while attempting to mimic my verbal authorization codes. Then Gideon placed his hand flat on the third thickest file. He looked directly into Natalie's terrified, tear-filled eyes. He informed her that this final document contained the sworn recorded testimony of a licensed medical professional. It detailed a highly illegal financial bribe offered by Natalie and Cameron in explicit exchange for a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation designed to strip a healthy man of his legal and human rights. The air in the room grew suffocatingly heavy. The reality of their actions, stripped of all their arrogant justifications, lay bare on the table. They were not misunderstood heirs trying to protect an aging father. They were common criminals caught in a meticulously documented web of federal fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Natalie began to shake violently, her hands coming up to cover her mouth as she stepped backward toward the open door, desperate to escape the crushing weight of the evidence. Gideon simply turned his head and gave a brief silent nod toward the left side of the table. Officer Miller stood up, the leather of his heavy utility belt creaking in the silent room, and reached slowly for the silver handcuffs hooked to his waist. The metallic rattle of Officer Miller unfastening his handcuffs echoed like a thunderclap in the silent conference room. Natalie physically recoiled, and her back hit the heavy oak door she had violently shoved open just minutes ago. Cameron stood frozen with his jaw slack and the remaining color completely draining from his face. I raised my right hand to give a silent signal for the officer to pause. It was not a gesture of mercy. I simply wanted to ensure the execution of this moment was entirely on my own terms. I reached across the polished mahogany table and pulled a specific stack of papers from the center folder Gideon had provided. I tossed them forward with a flick of my wrist. They fanned out perfectly across the glossy wood and stopped inches from Natalie. The top pages displayed a series of heavily highlighted bank statements. They clearly documented the systematic and unauthorized withdrawals totaling exactly $15,000. The numbers detailed how the funds were siphoned directly from my secure accounts over the past 4 months. Natalie stared down at the black and white numbers. The undeniable proof of her theft lay bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. Her initial reaction was a masterclass in manipulation. The aggressive and entitled predator who had stormed into the room instantly vanished. She crumpled and leaned heavily against the edge of the conference table as if her legs could no longer support her weight. A sudden and violent sob ripped from her throat. Tears began to stream down her face to ruin the last remnants of her makeup. She looked up at me with wide and pleading eyes as she desperately attempted to summon the image of the innocent little girl I had raised. She stammered through a chaotic flood of excuses. She claimed the money was just a temporary loan to cover a terrible business investment Cameron had forced her into. She wept that she was terrified of losing their home and that the financial pressure had clouded her judgment. She swore that she fully intended to repay every single cent once they were back on their feet. She begged me to remember that she was my daughter and my only child. She insisted that a father could not possibly send his own flesh and blood to a concrete prison cell over a simple misunderstanding. I sat completely motionless. I did not interrupt her frantic and weeping monologue. I did not offer a single word of comfort, nor did I show a fraction of anger. I let the silence of my demeanor amplify her desperation. I watched her weaponize her tears to use the very emotional leverage she believed had kept me blind and docile for so many years. A normal father would have broken under the weight of his daughter, weeping in front of a police officer. But the woman sobbing across the table was not my daughter. She was a stranger who had merely worn my daughter's face while plotting to destroy my life. When her voice finally cracked and her desperate apologies devolved into hyperventilating gasps, I made my next move. I picked up my smartphone from the table. Without breaking eye contact with Natalie, I synced the device to the conference room integrated audio system. I pressed play on the screen. The pristine acoustics of the law firm perfectly amplified the recording I had captured just days ago. The sound of Natalie's own voice filled the room, and it was crisp and incredibly cold. It was the recording of her conversation with Cameron in my kitchen, where they casually discussed the logistics of bribing a corrupt doctor to declare me legally incompetent. We all listened as her recorded voice cruelly calculated how quickly they could liquidate my assets once I was locked securely inside a state-mandated psychiatric ward. She complained about the smell of old age and the burden of waiting for my natural death. As the audio played to its devastating conclusion, I pressed another button on my phone to cast a hidden camera video feed directly onto the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall. The video showed the dimly lit interior of my private study. It showed Natalie creeping through the shadows while I was supposedly asleep. She kneeled on the floor and methodically punched the combination into my personal safe. The entire room was forced to watch as she greedily stuffed stacks of emergency cash and my late wife vintage jewelry into her designer handbag. The footage was undeniable and absolute. The recording clicked off, and the video faded to black. The absolute silence that reclaimed the conference room was heavier than a physical weight. The echo of her own malicious words seemed to hang in the air, to wrap around her neck like a tight cord. Natalie stopped crying instantly. The manufactured tears dried up and were replaced by a hollow and vacant stare of total defeat. The victim narrative she had just attempted to spin was utterly incinerated by the undeniable reality of her own documented cruelty. There was no excuse for a daughter plotting to steal her mother's jewelry while scheming to imprison her father. Cameron took a slow step backward to physically distance himself from his wife. His survival instincts were clearly kicking in as he realized their ship was fully submerged. Officer Miller took one deliberate step forward. He did not say a word, but his physical movement was a clear and unmistakable promise of what was about to happen next. I picked up a final document from the table. It was a single and densely typed page drafted with lethal precision by Gideon Shaw. I pushed it across the mahogany table until it rested directly on top of the stolen bank statements. I finally broke my silence. My voice was calm and steady and entirely devoid of warmth. I told Natalie that she had exactly one option left to avoid spending the next decade of her life in a federal penitentiary. I explained the terms of the document before her. It was a legally binding and irrevocable waiver. By signing it, she would permanently forfeit any and all future claims to my estate and my properties and my financial trusts. It also included a strict and non-negotiable stipulation that both she and Cameron must vacate the city limits within 24 hours and never attempt to contact me again. I told her she had precisely 1 minute to make her decision. She could pick up the brass pen resting beside the document, to sign away her inheritance and walk out of this building with nothing but the wet clothes on her back. Alternatively, she could refuse, and Officer Miller would immediately place her in handcuffs to transport her directly to the county jail on multiple felony charges of elder abuse and wire fraud and grand larceny. Natalie stared down at the paper. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely lift her arms. She looked at Cameron, but he refused to meet her gaze and stared firmly at the floor. She looked at Officer Miller, who stood with his hand resting casually near his handcuffs, and remained completely indifferent to her suffering. Finally, she looked at me. She searched my face for a flicker of the unconditional and foolish love she had exploited her entire life. She found absolutely nothing. The vault was closed forever, and the blind father she had known was gone. With a trembling hand, she picked up the heavy brass pen. A single tear splashed onto the polished wood of the table, and it was perhaps her first genuine tear of the entire ordeal. She leaned over and scratched her signature onto the dotted line. She pressed so hard the ink nearly tore through the paper. Cameron stepped forward and silently added his signature beside hers to seal their mutual defeat. Gideon smoothly retrieved the document and slid it back into his leather portfolio with a sharp nod of finality. I looked at the two ruined figures standing before me. I told them their time was up and they were no longer welcome in my presence. Natalie turned her body, with her posture completely broken, and walked out of the conference room without saying a single word. Cameron followed her like a beaten dog. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them to seal them out of my life permanently. I sat quietly in the warm sunlight of the office, while the phantom weight of a 30-year burden finally lifted from my shoulders. The amputation was complete, and my absolute freedom was secured. The heavy silence in the conference room was shattered, not by a confession of guilt or a plea for forgiveness from my daughter, but by the pathetic sound of a man desperately trying to save his own skin. Officer Miller had barely moved his hand toward the steel handcuffs resting on his utility belt when Cameron completely broke. The arrogant posture he had carried into the room, the false bravado of a successful executive, evaporated entirely. He backed away from the table, physically putting distance between himself and Natalie, treating his wife of 5 years as if she were suddenly infected with a lethal disease. He raised his hands defensively toward the police officer, and his voice cracked, rising an octave in pure panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Natalie and shouted that he had nothing to do with the psychiatric evaluation. The words spilled out of his mouth in a frantic, chaotic rush. He claimed that the entire scheme to have me committed to a medical facility was orchestrated exclusively by her. He painted himself as a naive bystander, a manipulated husband who was simply trying to support his grieving wife. He loudly declared that Natalie despised waiting for her inheritance, that she frequently complained about how long I was living, and that she had personally arranged the meeting with the corrupt doctor. Natalie turned her head slowly to look at the man she had married. The tears of self-pity that had been streaming down her face stopped, instantly replaced by an expression of absolute venomous shock. The alliance they had built on a foundation of shared greed and entitlement disintegrated right in front of my eyes. She had believed they were partners in a brilliant criminal enterprise, but she was now discovering the fundamental truth about cowards. A parasite will turn on its host the moment its own survival is threatened. She did not deny the accusations. She simply stared at Cameron with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She realized in that exact moment that she was entirely alone. Her father sat across from her, a cold and immovable wall of justice. Her husband stood beside her, eagerly offering her up to a federal prison to secure his own freedom. The marriage that had been celebrated with expensive champagne and lavish gifts was currently bleeding out on the polished mahogany floor of a corporate law firm. Cameron did not stop. He was operating on pure, frantic adrenaline, desperate to secure a deal before the handcuffs clicked shut. He admitted to the financial strain, confessing that he owed a massive sum of money to an underground gambling syndicate. He admitted that he was terrified for his life, but he loudly maintained that stealing my money was Natalie's proposed solution to his debts. He threw every shared secret, every whispered plan they had made in the dark, directly onto the table, sacrificing his wife to purchase his own amnesty. Gideon Shaw observed the pathetic display with the calm, detached interest of a scientist watching an insect under a microscope. He did not care about their domestic collapse. He cared only about executing my legal directive. Gideon raised his hand, cutting off Cameron's frantic babbling. He stated in a voice devoid of any sympathy that the legal system did not care whose idea the fraud was. They were legally married. Their finances were tethered, and the evidence clearly implicated both of them in grand larceny and conspiracy. Gideon tapped the heavy brass pen against the wooden table. He reminded them that the ultimatum was still active. They had roughly 30 seconds remaining to sign the irrevocable waiver of inheritance, or they would both leave the building in police custody. Cameron did not hesitate for a single second. He lunged forward, snatching the brass pen from the table with trembling fingers. He did not bother to read the fine print. He did not care about the stipulations or the legal jargon. He cared only about avoiding a concrete cell. He bent over the table and aggressively scratched his signature onto the dotted line, legally surrendering any future claim to my estate. He threw the pen down and stepped back, his chest heaving as he looked at Officer Miller, silently begging for confirmation that his cowardly capitulation was enough to save him. Natalie stood frozen. She looked down at the document at Cameron's frantic signature, and then back up at me. She was searching for a final lifeline, a tiny fraction of the unconditional fatherly love she had exploited for decades. She found absolutely nothing. I looked back at her with the cold, flat gaze of a man who had successfully amputated an infected limb to save his own life. I felt no sorrow. I felt no anger. I simply waited for the transaction to conclude, realizing that her charms, her tears, and her manipulations were completely useless. The final spark of her defiance died. Her shoulders slumped in total defeat. She picked up the pen her husband had discarded. Her hand shook so violently that she had to brace her wrist against the edge of the mahogany table. She signed her name slowly, the blue ink securing her absolute financial ruin. By executing that signature, she officially walked away from millions of dollars, a secure future, and a father who would have given her the world if she had only possessed the decency to ask rather than steal. Gideon smoothly retrieved the signed documents and slipped them back into his leather portfolio. The sharp click of the briefcase latches signaled the definitive end of the war. Gideon looked up and informed them that they were now legally bound to vacate the city limits. He stated that any attempt to contact me, approach my new residence, or interfere with my assets would result in immediate arrest for violating a standing injunction. I did not offer them a goodbye. I did not offer them a final piece of fatherly advice. I simply told them to get out of my sight. Officer Miller stepped forward, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors. Natalie and Cameron turned and walked out of the conference room. They did not speak to each other. They did not touch. They walked down the long carpeted hallway of the law firm in total silence, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of the police officer, ensuring their departure. They were escorted into the private elevator sent down to the ground floor and pushed out through the revolving glass doors into the cold reality of the Seattle streets. They stood on the concrete sidewalk outside the towering glass skyscraper. They had arrived an hour ago, demanding millions, fully confident in their ability to manipulate the system. They were now standing on the curb with absolutely nothing. Their credit cards were frozen. Their bank accounts were locked. They had no home to return to, no car to drive, and a cheap, damp motel room was their only remaining shelter. The sheer gravity of their self-inflicted destruction was beginning to settle heavily over them. Before either of them could formulate a plan, a sharp, aggressive buzzing sound broke the silence. Cameron's smartphone vibrated violently in the pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket. He pulled the device out and looked at the glowing screen. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The caller ID did not display a name. It displayed a scrambled, blocked number. It was a number Cameron knew intimately. It was the same number that had been calling him relentlessly for weeks, demanding immediate repayment of the massive gambling debts he had accumulated. He had promised the syndicate that the money was guaranteed. He had promised them that a highly lucrative real estate sale was finalizing and that he would have hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred to their offshore accounts by the end of the week. But the house was gone. The money was permanently locked away in an untouchable trust. The entire financial lifeline he had promised to his dangerous creditors had just been legally incinerated in the conference room upstairs. The phone continued to vibrate in his palm, a relentless, terrifying demand for payment that he could no longer satisfy. Word traveled blindingly fast in the financial underworld. The syndicate likely already knew that his accounts were frozen. They knew he had lost his leverage. He was no longer a wealthy executive experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. He was a bankrupt, desperate man who owed a massive sum to people who did not forgive debts. Cameron stared at the ringing phone, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. The terror in his eyes was absolute. He looked up and down the busy city street, his survival instincts screaming at him to run. He did not say a word to his wife. He did not offer an explanation or a plan. He simply turned his back on Natalie, shoved the ringing phone deep into his pocket, and began to run down the sidewalk, pushing past pedestrians as he fled into the anonymous crowd. Natalie stood entirely alone on the curb, watching her husband sprint away from the consequences of his own actions, leaving her stranded in the wake of the devastation they had built together. Exactly 90 days had passed since I walked out of the conference room at Shaw and Associates and left my former life behind. The crisp morning air of the Oregon coast drifted through the open sliding glass doors of my new beachfront apartment. The relentless gray storms of Seattle were a distant memory replaced by the rhythmic, soothing sound of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the rocky shoreline. I sat at a small round table on my balcony, holding a ceramic mug of freshly brewed black coffee. The steam curled upward, catching the golden light of the early sun. I wore a comfortable linen shirt and slacks, a sharp contrast to the rigid tailored suits I had worn for decades as armor. I was no longer a man preparing for war. I was a man who had already won his peace. The transition over the last 3 months had been a profound exercise in unlearning. For 30 years, my nervous system had been conditioned to expect a crisis. I was accustomed to the sudden demanding phone calls regarding unpaid rent, totaled vehicles, or fabricated business emergencies. I was used to the heavy, suffocating weight of being the sole financial pillar for people who viewed my generosity as an endless entitlement. During the first few weeks in this coastal town, the silence of my smartphone felt almost unnatural. I would catch myself waiting for the inevitable disaster to strike. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, that phantom anxiety slowly evaporated. My days belonged entirely to me. I spent my mornings walking along the sandy beach, feeling the cold, salt water wash over my bare feet. I spent my afternoons reading thick historical biographies, uninterrupted by manipulative requests for money. My offshore trust accounts were secure, managed by an elite team of financial fiduciaries who answered only to me, but my true wealth was this absolute, unbroken tranquility. My smartphone rested on the glass table beside my coffee mug. It was a new device with a new, highly restricted number. Only Gideon Shaw, my wealth manager Arthur, and a select few local acquaintances possessed it. I kept it on silent mode, preferring to let the natural sounds of the ocean dictate the rhythm of my morning. A soft, brief vibration disturbed the quiet atmosphere. The screen illuminated, displaying a single unread text message. I picked up the device. The sender was listed as an unknown number. I tapped the screen and opened the message, my expression remaining completely neutral. The text consisted of 4 short, desperate sentences. Dad, I am sorry. The debt collectors took everything. Cameron ran away. Please help me. I read the words, slowly analyzing them, with the clinical, detached precision of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt ledger. I read them a second time, searching my own chest for a familiar pang of parental guilt, a lingering shred of obligation, or a sudden urge to rush in and solve the catastrophe. I found absolutely nothing. The internal reservoir of blind, unconditional love that I had drawn from for decades was completely bone dry. Natalie had finally hit the concrete floor of reality. The timeline made perfect sense. Gideon had informed me that the illegal lenders Cameron was entangled with were not men who possessed patience. Without my wealth to act as a shield, the consequences of their lavish, fraudulent lifestyle had finally caught up to them. The luxury cars had undoubtedly been repossessed. The remaining jewelry had been seized. Whatever miserable living arrangement they had managed to secure after being evicted from my former home had been stripped bare. The detail regarding Cameron was the least surprising element of the entire message. A coward is remarkably predictable when faced with the consequences of his own actions. He had willingly thrown Natalie to the wolves in Gideon's conference room to save himself from a federal prison sentence. It was entirely expected that he would abandon her to face the violent wrath of a gambling syndicate the moment the money officially ran out. He had fled like a rat, abandoning a sinking ship, leaving his wife alone to absorb the devastating impact of the debts he had accrued and the life they had ruined together. I focused on the words my daughter had chosen. She began with an apology, but it was not an apology for her actions. She was not expressing remorse for attempting to bribe a corrupt physician. She was not apologizing for conspiring to have me locked inside a secure psychiatric facility so she could plunder my life savings. She was not seeking forgiveness for the profound, monstrous betrayal of treating her own father like a disposable cash register. Her apology was entirely hollow. She was only sorry because she had lost. She was only reaching out because the harsh, unforgiving world had finally cornered her, and the man she had married had left her to face it alone. She asked for my help. After everything she had done after the absolute destruction of our family bond, she still fundamentally believed that my role in the universe was to absorb her suffering and finance her survival. She believed that beneath the legal injunctions and the frozen accounts, I was still the same soft, malleable father she could manipulate with a few desperate tears. She was wrong. That father had died the night I discovered her plot. The man sitting on the balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean was someone entirely different. I felt no desire to reply. There was no grand, triumphant speech left to deliver. There was no need to explain the mechanics of karma or the harsh reality of personal responsibility. Engaging with her even to deny her request would simply open a channel of communication she did not deserve to possess. I had already given her the most valuable lesson of her entire life when I walked out of that law firm. I had taught her that love with boundaries is the only love that is real, and that actions have brutal, inescapable consequences. If she survived this ordeal, she would have to do it through her own labor, her own resilience, and her own sweat. I was no longer her savior. I pressed my index finger against the illuminated screen. I selected the desperate message from the unknown sender. A small menu appeared offering a series of options. I did not hesitate. I tapped the icon to delete the message entirely. The text vanished from the screen, wiping away the digital evidence of her misery. I navigated to the contact settings and selected the option to block the number permanently. The software confirmed the action, ensuring that no further pleas, no more tears, and no more manipulations could ever reach my device. I set the phone face down on the glass table. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a long, slow sip of the dark coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the brief chill brought on by the memory of my past. I looked out over the railing of the balcony. The ocean stretched out endlessly before me, a vast expanse of deep blue water meeting a clear, cloudless sky. The tide was rolling in the waves, crashing against the rocks with a steady, cleansing rhythm. A gentle breeze blew off the water, carrying the fresh, clean scent of salt and pine. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the morning sun warm my face. The final tether to the ghosts of Seattle had been severed. My legacy was secure, my mind was sharp, and the horizon before me belonged to no one but myself. The sliding glass doors of my penthouse opened with a soft mechanical hum, letting in the crisp and salt-laced breeze blowing straight off Seattle Bay. I stepped out onto the expansive terrace. High above the chaotic pulse of the city, the air was remarkably clean and sharp. The relentless and suffocating gray storms that had perfectly mirrored the severe turmoil of the past year had finally broken. In their place stretched an endless and brilliant canopy of pale blue. I leaned my forearms against the heavy glass railing and looked down at the bustling harbor below. Massive cargo ships and sleek white ferries cut slow and deliberate wakes across the deep sapphire water. The entire world was moving forward, and it was entirely unbothered by the dramatic collapse of the fragile and greedy empire my daughter had tried to build on my shoulders. I brought a heavy porcelain mug to my lips and took a slow sip of pure and uncompromised black coffee. The bitter and robust flavor grounded me firmly in the present moment. For decades, my mornings had been strictly dictated by the relentless demands of a manufactured and exhausting family life. I had played the role of the silent provider and the endless well of financial resources. I had been the foolishly loyal father who was fully expected to absorb every insult with a patient and accommodating smile. I had allowed my own identity to be slowly eroded by the extreme expectations of a daughter who viewed my existence solely as an agonizingly slow countdown to her inheritance. I had worn the heavy and suffocating mask of blind paternal sacrifice because that is precisely what polite society demands of aging parents. We are expected to bleed ourselves entirely dry. We are conditioned to turn our life savings into a velvet red carpet for our children to walk upon, even as they ruthlessly trample our dignity under their expensive designer shoes. But that man was completely dead. He had been quietly buried the exact moment Natalie attempted to trade my personal freedom for her financial comfort. The absolute silence of my new environment was the most profound luxury my wealth had ever purchased. There were no more frantic and entitled phone calls demanding emergency funds to cover fabricated crises. There were no more passive-aggressive visits engineered to evaluate the contents of my personal safe or measure the dimensions of my property. There were no more legal threats and no more corrupt doctors and no more manipulative tears weaponized to secure my compliance. The toxicity had been surgically removed from my life with total precision. It is a terrifying thing to amputate your own flesh and blood, to realize that the child you raised has become a dangerous parasite. But walking straight through that fire had forged an ironclad clarity within my soul. I did not miss them. I felt no lingering guilt and no agonizing remorse. The space they had previously occupied in my life was not left empty. It was immediately filled with a profound and unshakable peace. As I watched a flock of white seagulls bank sharply against the wind over the sparkling bay, I reflected deeply on the true measure of a man and his life. We are taught from a young age to measure our greatness by the legacy we leave behind. We measure it by the properties we deed to our heirs and by the massive trust funds we establish for the next generation. But I had learned the hard way that a financial legacy has absolutely no value when it is handed to those who completely lack the moral spine to earn it. I had realized that the true greatness of a man does not lie in the wealth he silently accumulates for ungrateful descendants. It lies entirely in his absolute courage to defend his own sovereignty. It lies in the brutal strength required to draw a line in the concrete and completely refuse to be victimized by the people who share his last name. True legacy is the relentless preservation of your own self-respect. By stripping Natalie and Cameron of their stolen future, I had not committed an act of cruelty. I had executed an act of profound and necessary justice. I had reclaimed the total ownership of my own existence. The millions of dollars secured safely in my offshore accounts and managed by my private financial team were no longer a massive target for greedy predators. They were the high-octane fuel for my own remaining years. I thought about the various charitable organizations I was now quietly funding. I directed my resources to legal defense funds dedicated to protecting vulnerable and elderly individuals from the exact nightmare I had just successfully navigated. I thought about the aggressive new investments I was making and the international travels I was meticulously planning. I was actively choosing to live a life completely unburdened by parasitic obligations. I was over 70 years old, yet standing on this sunlit balcony, I felt a vital and surging energy that I had not experienced since I was a young man building his very first company. The heavy iron chain of family obligation had been completely shattered. I took a final and deep breath of the ocean air and let the cold wind fill my lungs to capacity. Far below me, the city of Seattle continued its relentless and mechanical rhythm. Somewhere out there in that sprawling urban maze, or perhaps banished far beyond its borders, two ruined people were waking up to the crushing reality of their own disastrous actions. They would spend the rest of their miserable lives running from the violent debt collectors they had provoked and the catastrophic consequences they had willingly triggered. Their nightmare was just beginning, and it was a permanent prison constructed entirely of their own arrogance and deceit. But their miserable fate was no longer my concern. My slate was completely clean, and my conscience was entirely clear. I turned away from the glass railing and walked back inside the warm and quiet sanctuary of my modern penthouse. I set my empty coffee mug on the polished marble kitchen counter. The dark shadows of the past were entirely eradicated by the brilliant morning light flooding through the windows. A new and magnificent chapter had officially begun, and I was going to fiercely enjoy every single second of it. The greatest lesson I learned through this ordeal is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and the absence of boundaries is a dangerous invitation to betrayal. For years, I believed that being a good father meant absorbing the consequences of my children's poor choices, thinking that if I just provided enough, they would eventually find their own way. I was profoundly wrong. By shielding Natalie and Cameron from the realities of their own greed, I inadvertently nurtured the very parasites that sought to destroy me. I learned that true love is not defined by how much you can give, but by how well you can protect your own dignity. When you allow your boundaries to be crossed, you are not being a martyr for your family. You are teaching them that your well-being is optional. This realization was painful, yet it was the most liberating truth I have ever encountered. I discovered that I did not need to buy their affection or justify my existence through their successes. My value as a person was inherent, not tied to the contents of my safe or the deeds to my properties. Once I stopped providing the resources they coveted, their manufactured love evaporated, revealing the hollow nature of their connection to me. This taught me that you can only be used if you provide the utility, and you can only be betrayed if you grant people the power to hurt you. Realizing this gave me the courage to dismantle the false life I had built. I had to let go of the fantasy that if I just tried harder, things would get better. I had to face the reality that some people do not want to be saved. They only want to be sustained. The peace I feel now is the direct result of that understanding. It is a quiet, steady peace that comes from knowing I am no longer responsible for their survival or their happiness. I learned that a man's legacy is not found in what he leaves for those who treat him with disdain, but in his unwavering refusal to remain a victim of those he once loved. I also learned that it is never too late to reclaim your life. Age is not a reason to become invisible or to let others dictate the terms of your existence. Dignity is a lifelong pursuit, and the moment you prioritize it over the demands of ungrateful family, you find a strength that no amount of money could ever purchase. I am not the same man who lived in the shadow of my daughter's expectations. I am a man who has walked through the fire and emerged whole because I finally decided that my own peace was worth more than the cost of a broken family. Now that you have seen how I reclaimed my own life, I invite you to share in the comments. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace from those who take you for granted?